Welcome to The Lost Debate, a show for political eclectics. I'm Ravi Gupta, and this is a special episode. Longtime listeners will know I'm a former school principal and superintendent of a network of charter schools in Tennessee and Mississippi. I care a lot about education, as I know many of you do. And I've long felt like the national conversation, whether it's in our politics or in our media, is often lacking in ambition, nuance, and detail on questions of K-12 education in particular. And so what I want to do today is just take a step back and talk about what would an ideal system or system of schools and supports, the equivalent of what a K-12 system in my world, what would that look like if I were designing a system? What kind of policy changes should we make? And what kind of innovations should we see both within schools and in communities? And so what I'm going to try to do here is be fairly comprehensive, but I'm not going to hit everything. I'm not going to hit higher education, for example. I'm going to barely touch pre-K and childcare. I'll talk a little bit about it, but not a ton. And I'll try to pick a few spots where I'll drill down. And my goal here is just to give you a forward-looking vision of what a great education system should be. And I also want to work within the constraints that exist. I don't want to just, put a pie in the sky vision out there that has no chance of ever being implemented. So I'm going to try to work within the bounds of reality, but be ambitious within our reality. What's fascinating about school and education generally is it's one of the last remaining collective experiences left in American society. It sure no, two students have the exact same experience, but we generally follow a similar path. Now, depending on your resources, there could be pretty dramatic differences in what that path looks like. But by and large, most kids, unless you're homeschooled, show up to a school every day and go lockstep through grade levels. But our society has become more individualistic, capitalistic, and isolated. We'll link in the show notes to a cover story Derek Thompson just did in The Atlantic, where he goes through all the data. We've never been, at least in my lifetime, been as isolated, individualistic as we are today. And we're in America, the most capitalistic, thriving economy the world has ever seen, perhaps one of the more unequal as well. But this is not that kind of podcast. That's not what we're here to talk about. But schools, being one of these last potentially collective experiences we have, are potentially at risk. This terrain that we have that we kind of meet on, right, imperfectly, is probably at risk. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, do we want schools to solve for that or to become a reflection of that shift towards more individualistic, isolated experiences? This is a question that I'm going to come back to throughout the pod. Again, should schools reflect back this drift towards individualism, isolation potentially, or should they solve for it? That's a big question. Now, on the face of it, the reports of the Trump administration considering dissolving the Department of Education seem to be an indication of where they want to go. Shrink the system, push decisions down to the local level, which is a charitable way of describing it. We've covered elsewhere the question of what the department does, so I won't get into it here, but we can link to the many episodes we've done there, including with Rick Hess, et cetera. But it's important to talk about just what getting rid of the Department of Education would mean, at least for this discussion about the future of education. The federal government covers around 13 to 14% of spending on public education in the country. So this is mostly a state and local issue. The federal government distributes funds like Title I for students with economically disadvantaged, schools with economically disadvantaged students. It distributes federal special education funding. It also administers college loans, which, again, we're not here to talk about higher education. And there are other funding streams, and this funding also comes with a lot of regulation. But the key, I think, will be, for those of you who care about those funding streams, I being one of them, is to focus on preserving those funding mechanisms more than the department as a whole. To me, I have, my opinion about whether we should prioritize keeping a department specific to education in this country. I think we should. If we're going to have a Department of Defense, and we're going to have a Department of State. We're going to have a Department of Small Businesses and the Interior. We should probably have a department dedicated to the future of our kids. But that is a less important question than preserving the money that's flowing from that department. So for folks who are interested in that debate, that's where I'd focus my time. And for the regulations there, and we certainly have had a lot of conversations about this, a lot of those regulations can be recreated at a state level for states that are interested in preserving them, almost all of them. And so that is where I would move a lot of my attention to the extent that they deregulate. And I would honestly take a fresh look at each of those regulations and ask whether they're smart or not. In 2013, John White, who's been on this podcast, who came out of the New York City Joel Klein era and then became the state superintendent in Louisiana, gave a speech in Washington, D.C., where he basically talked about how hard it is as a state superintendent and then at the local level running schools with just the heap of different regulations that come down from the federal and state level, and then how you have to just hire all these people to comply with these often confusing rules and that they're not often serving kids. So for those of you out there who are pro-regulation in general, I would take a fresh look. Like, forget what Elon Musk is saying or whatever and just say, all right, in good faith, are these good rules or not that we want to recreate at the federal level? But again, so much happens at the state, local, and family level. That's what I want to focus on mostly in this podcast. And it really starts with a question, which is, what is the purpose of schools? What's the purpose of education? Right? If you were reading the news, you would think that we're hopelessly divided on this question. Liberals stress equity, justice, potentially labor rights, unions, right? That's what liberals and Democrats spend a lot of time thinking about. So equity, justice, labor. Conservatives stress efficiency, nationalism. Sometimes they talk about parent power, like groups like Moms for Liberty. And in certain cases, like the Oklahoma superintendent, they talk about religion. This is a big driver, for instance, for some homeschooling families. And there are crossover movements, right? So the school reform movement that I was a part of at various points included Obama, Jeb Bush, George W. Bush. They talked about equity plus efficiency, or they would call it at that time equality plus efficiency, right? They want, even George W. Bush, who, like, if you're a Democrat listening to this, he was an architect of No Child Left Behind, which, among other things, allowed for us to track data on how subgroups are doing. So how are Black kids doing? How are Hispanic students doing? How are students with disabilities doing? How are economically disadvantaged students doing, right? That was an equity play. I know we don't think of George W. Bush that way, but he did. But he and Obama and Jeb and people like that, Lamar Alexander, were also about efficiency, spending resources well, and you could also add in there accountability. So, testing, asking whether schools are actually performing well, and then shutting down potentially or holding accountable schools that don't meet those goals. That was a crossover movement. So you could think about what I just said in terms of what liberals and conservatives care about within our education system. You'd think that we're divided, right? Justice and equity versus nationalism and efficiency, parent power, and efficiency versus labor rights, right? These are all big divides if you are reading the headlines. And those are real debates and real divisions. And they raise a lot of important questions. Now, they pale in comparison to, I think, the common ground on what we agree on about the goals of schools. We just don't talk about what we agree on. And at a basic level, what's the goal of schools, right? The New York Times did an article, I think it was a year or two ago, asking different experts and parents, what's the goal of schools? And they got like 1 million different answers, right? And I think that's an interesting reflection of why we should probably embrace a little bit of diversity of school models, which is something I'll get back to. But here's what I think most of us can agree on, if not everybody. On the basic level, this is like a Maslow hierarchy of needs. School is about childcare, right? It's a safe place to bring your kids while you have to work, right? We don't talk about that a lot, but as a former school principal who had an extended school day, a lot of people would send their kids to our school, not because we had a great academic program, which we did, not because we had a great culture that was positive, because I hope we did, but because we were a place that was open longer, started earlier and ended later than somewhere else. And they liked that. That was basically free childcare. So number one, childcare. Number two, knowledge. So we want kids to just know about the world. Skills, right? If you saw the recent NAEP data, knowledge and skills, we are not doing as well as we should be on those two areas, but certainly parents want their kids to learn to read, to write, to do math, etc. That is an important function of a school. Values, right? We want kids, I know that we don't talk about this because we differ on so many different values, but, right from wrong, don't lie, don't, keep your hands to yourself. And you can get into higher values, you get to these fancy private schools and they've got these Latin values and mottos and yada, yada, yada. You want your kids to learn how to be good people at school. Experiences, all kinds of experiences, right? From going on field trips to having recess to having all these kind of collective moments that happen at schools, being a part of the school play, being part of sports. You can go on and on and on and on. You have experiences in school, celebrating your birthday with your friends at school. If you think about just all the kinds of major life moments you had at school, that is a function of the school. Making friends, right? You think about how many of your closest friends did you make in school, whether it was K to 12 or higher education? Probably a lot of them, right? So those are basic functions of schools that basically none of us disagree on, right? There are other less sexy elements of schools that we don't talk about a lot, like an employer of adults, right? If you listen to Democrats, they're probably more likely to acknowledge that as a major factor in their decision-making. If you ask me, sometimes they care more about the adults than kids, and that's a critique I have of some of my Democratic friends, or at least their decisions seem to imply that. But, schools are major employers of adults. In certain cases, they're the largest employer of certain communities, especially some rural communities, and you have to take that seriously. What else can schools be, though, right? So we just talked about childcare, knowledge, skills, values, experience, friends, an employer of adults. That's a lot of functions, by the way, for one institution. Seems important, but what else can these schools do? They could be a place for people to develop habits and passions, right? You think about, well, when did you learn whatever it is that you are? Are you an athlete? Are you an artist, right? Are you a mathematician? Are you a scientist? Are you a doctor, right? You probably, the origins of that passion, whether it's a hobby or a profession, were developed in school. You also have certain habits. Are you the kind of person who gets ahead of things? You finish your homework the first thing when you get home from school? Or are you somebody who kind of waits to the last minute to hand in things, right? Are you an early riser? Are you the kind of person who basically runs out the door and races to school and now do that for work and all that? These are all kinds of things that you learn in school. Do you gossip or not, right? These are all kinds of things that probably have their origin in school. Habits, passions, who you are as a person. School is also a place where you can have adventures, right? Within and outside of the school. Obviously some adventures could be field trips. Sometimes it could be like even fancy schools sometimes have study abroad programs or trips abroad or trips around your city and state. But there are adventures within the schools, right? Like rebelling against the school. Like when I transferred from my public high school to a Catholic high school, and shout out to my mom who worked 2 jobs to pay for my tuition at that Catholic high school, at Moore Catholic High School. We had so many adventures where we would just rebel against the system. The same was true at IS 51, Intermediate 51, School 51 in Staten Island, where we would do all kinds of things to give hell to the school. This was kind of a collective experience, right? And I learn to get into trouble and get out of trouble or face the consequences or not. That's a rite of passage for many people. We also learn to create meaningful things, right? And we don't do this enough. But in some cases, if you're a painter, you painted your first picture. If you're a musician, you created your first musical piece, potentially, in school or around school. You wrote your first essay or your first story in school, right? We don't focus enough on creating meaningful things. This is something I'll come back to. We focus a lot on consumption and regurgitation, but school can be a meaningful place for creation. But, the thing we create the most in school, what is the real goal of school, in my opinion, is to create an identity. You go to school to figure out who you are. And if a school is doing its job well, you emerge from school with a sense of who you are and what your place is in the world. I will certainly come back to that. And I will be citing throughout the course of this podcast a study from Populous. It's called the Purpose of Education Index. And our friend Todd Rose, who runs Populous, has been on this podcast many times, including when they put out that study. And essentially, it's a way to find out from parents using a sophisticated method, not just what they would have told pollsters, but what they truly believe the purpose of an education is. And I'll cite some of that data as we go. Let me quickly talk about childcare and pre-K, since I know this is a big issue for a lot of people, and it's the gateway for a lot into the system. Right now, over 14 million, or somewhere in the vicinity of 67 to 68% of children in the United States have all available parents in the workforce, which means that childcare before you get to the traditional public school system is really important. The federal government delivered what was a record amount of money, $52 billion in COVID relief funding to prop up childcare. And that money largely has run out in 2023. And a lot of this money was either stabilization or expansion money, and it was spent just dramatically different in different states. And actually, the Biden administration and their allies in the Republican Party, this is a pretty bipartisan effort from what I understand, loosened the restrictions that basically allowed states to spend this as they wanted. They basically said, spend this as you will, and different states made different decisions. The biggest symmetry, I think, that we see between blue and red states who I think are doing this well is in the area of deregulation. And this may sound like, Project 2025. Why would we want to deregulate childcare? Well, we'll link in the show notes to this episode we did about DC childcare. Often there are just opaque and confusing burdens on people who want to get into childcare at a time when we have a huge scarcity of providers in a lot of places in this country. And in the case of DC, we talked about how the city of DC was instituting this requirement that childcare providers, the equivalent of teachers in childcare, have a college degree, which was an expensive and unnecessary burden on the people doing the work at a time when there weren't a lot of people doing the work. Other regulations, for instance, are caps on the amount of kids you could have in a child care facility, for example, which obviously drives up costs and increased scarcity. And a lot of states are starting to take an axe to these types of requirements. You wouldn't expect California to be on this list based on your expectation of what a liberal state would do. But in 2019, they did, you could think of this as a regulation, but it really was a deregulation. They prohibited local governments from requiring family child care providers to obtain zoning permits or business licenses. They also protected providers from eviction or denial of rental opportunities based solely on their intent to operate a child care business from their homes. So basically saying, if you want to start a child care business, your city or state can't force you to get a license, can't stop you from using your home. That is a huge win because often these cities and states, because they don't want a lot of people parking and dropping their kids off at the facility, et cetera, or just it offends their sensibilities or whatever, are going to try to limit people from creating childcare providers in their neighborhoods. And as we all know, cities and states love to create business licensing requirements because it's a revenue generator and just another way to tell people what to do. California miraculously decided to get rid of those barriers. Connecticut did something very similar. That is a good development. There are red states that are doing the same. Oklahoma went a step further, and I like these kinds of deregulations. They passed a law prohibiting localities from passing regulations that limit the capacity of providers beyond what the state already provided, right? And so they were saying basically the state will set the limit on how many kids you can have in a child care facility. You can't make it any smaller. Now, I would even go further than this and just say, let's not have a cap. Like, let the market decide. Like, if a child care facility truly is so, it's like 100 kids and one adult, right? Chances are a parent's not going to drop their kid off at that child care facility. The market, I think, will do a good job of sorting this out. And if they did, that would be more a reflection on how urgent the matter is, the lack of childcare, than it is about what that one practitioner is doing. Meaning, if you were so desperate that you dropped your kid off at a place where there were 50 kids and one adult, Number one, you probably don't have any other options. And number two, if it wasn't for that facility, your kid would probably be alone. And that's an emergency, right? So the problem there isn't the 50-person facility, it's the entire environment. And the alternative could be way worse. It's important to recognize that childcare is often given through vouchers. It's actually less frequent than in the traditional K-12 system to see districts directly running childcare in pre-K. And I think what we could do there is just make the compliance and approval process for getting these vouchers as easy as possible. And also, we're facing a huge shortage in a lot of places of people to do the jobs in these childcare facilities, and we just need to do more workforce development. In Iowa, they have these two programs called Teaches and Wages, which we don't need to go into here. But all across the country, there are attempts to try to increase that workforce. I would say that the climate around immigration is going to make this a lot harder because immigration is a really good way to solve this problem. We have a program called the J-1 visa, which ostensibly should be covering a lot of people coming here to do childcare, but it's actually largely wrapped up in people doing summer work and travel, college students, research scholars, au pairs, camp counselors, and you go all the way down the list and you start to find childcare. So we should increase the amount of people using J-1 visas generally, and especially around childcare, and extend those visas so that people are here more permanently doing that kind of work. It's one thing to be an au pair. It's another thing to be working at your childcare facility. You kind of want that person here as long as they possibly can be. So those are just some ideas on childcare. Let's talk K-12 generally. And let's start at the high level here. Structurally, I want to make the case that we should be largely loosening things up and allowing more and more people to be empowered to start new school models of many different types, right? Some people call this school choice. I tend to think of this as localism and empowerment. And we'll link in the show notes to an article by Yale law professor James Foreman. It is called The Secret History of School Choice. And I'll just refer to some things that James talks about here. He goes through in a multi-part essay just how this idea of empowerment and localism, basically putting more hands in decision-making and power in the hands of individuals at the local level, has actually been a staple of civil rights in this country, right? He starts going all the way back to freed slaves who created schools for themselves and their children during Reconstruction. In part two, he talks about the alternative schools movement that was created during the civil rights movement of the 1960s. He talks about the Mississippi Freedom Summer of 1964, in which civil rights organizations and volunteer teachers from the North responded to the inadequacies of the Mississippi education system, for example, by establishing freedom schools for Blacks. And a lot of those schools were disbanded in the summer of 1964. But as Foreman points out, that legacy of the Freedom Schools movement went on to influence what was the original progressive history of school choice and reform, which are the Northern Free Schools, and what eventually became the movement towards community control in the late 60s, which was what school reform meant back then. And actually, when I talked to Dana Goldstein of the New York Times and the author of Teacher Wars, she writes about this a bit in her work, Teacher Wars, and she and I talked about it briefly. But the roots of what we think of as school reform actually overlapped tremendously with civil rights, really came from civil rights, and were really about community control, local control, and empowerment, and actually building innovation and excellence from the ground up, empowering people from the ground up, not the top down, which is often how we think of it, especially those in democratic circles, right? We oppose things like charter schools, vouchers, education savings accounts, which are really routes to get more and more people starting schools with as much freedom to do that as possible, right? So I mention all of this to say, from a structural level, there has been a lot of energy from progressives trying to fight community control, school choice, dezoning. But I want to remind you of your values here, right? Equity, empowerment, localism. Those tend to be values that Democrats have, right? You want to put power in the hands of people. You want to empower them. You want equity, right? You want better outcomes for kids, right? And I posit here that you should be thinking differently. Instead of saying, hey, let's centralize as much control and decision-making power as possible. Let's actually push out that control and power to as many people who know better than you do. There's like a little bit of systemic humility here about what's best for their kids in their communities. At a theoretical level, I think you understand this. But I think when you start to think of who supports vouchers, charters, right? Obama was a charter supporter, but you probably think of like vouchers and ESAs as like the big bad Republicans, right? But people could have different reason for supporting these things. You think about the fact that, for instance, Section 8, which was originally in part a conservative right-wing attempt to reform our public housing systems, is now something like aggressively guarded and protected by Democrats who want to expand these programs, make them more generous, but certainly view them as a important tool, probably a much more important tool than traditionally government-run public housing, which are not great experiences for people. You also think of Medicaid and Medicare, right? You don't think of our delivery mechanism as solely government-run clinics and hospitals for Medicaid and Medicare. You actually think that the system of accepting, you want more people to accept Medicaid and Medicare within the private sector, and you don't want people to discriminate against people holding those vouchers in the healthcare system. So we think about this at an expansive level in housing. We think about it at an expansive level in healthcare. We even think about it in food when you think of SNAP benefits. I posit that we should extend that level of thought to education as well through ESAs, vouchers, charters, democratize not just access to seats, but also to leadership and entrepreneurial opportunities within schools, so that there's not just one way to go lockstep through a traditional school system and, kiss the right ass and, bend the knee to the right bureaucrat to become a school principal, which really means you're just a middle manager who has to deal with a lot of red tape and doesn't have a lot of control over your schools. No, we want to create as what Adam Pesek calls a permissionless system, where people can be entrepreneurs, can be civic leaders, be educational leaders with passion, energy, ingenuity as early as possible, and free of as many illogical constraints as we possibly can muster. What would this yield? It would yield, first of all, more diverse and smaller school models. Surf Skate School, for instance, in Surf Skate Science in Florida, we profiled a school that, among other things, is farming in Tennessee. I had a lot of progressive friends reply to that video that we did in Tennessee saying, whoa, this seems awesome, because when you don't know it's a school that either uses vouchers or ESAs or is, well thought of within more right-wing education circles, you're like, oh, this seems great. But once you're told you're not supposed to like that school, you think differently about it. And this really, by loosening up the system, you create a new wave of entrepreneurial providers, people who have a certain level of ambition and innovation that we just don't get in the traditional system. It also can change the perception of the profession. Right now, people view public education as bureaucratic, lockstep, as I talked about, deprofessionalized, ossified, right? It's not exactly the place you go if you want to push the boundaries and do big, innovative things. Even the private sector, there's a lack of civic spirit or do-gooderness. You go to the private school in your town, you're probably going to kids who are going to be all right whether you're there or not. And often those institutions are also stodgy and, sometimes could be resistant to change because there's often such a small level of competition within cities and often not a lot of new providers that people kind of keep doing things the way that they're doing and aren't really competing against each other. But we can make this profession more sexy, enticing, and nimble, and I think loosening things up can do that. Now, the teaching profession. What I would do in the teaching profession here, and I talked a little bit about this with Dana Goldstein, I would actually give teachers more autonomy. I think in a lot of cases, those of us in the school reform movement were trying to find so many different ways to tell teachers how to do their jobs, how to evaluate them, using centralized mechanisms of evaluation in our state levels, and really tie their performance to state test scores, right? Now, I do think that a great teacher should have great test scores within their schools and certainly demonstrate great growth for their students year over year, because that's like a level of basic necessity, right? Can your kids read? Can they write? Can they perform math? Do they know science and history? Like any good teacher should be able to demonstrate those results. So I don't mind taking into account test scores in evaluating whether somebody's good or not. But I would push a lot of that decision-making power as local as possible, probably down to the level of the school building more than at the level of the state and certainly the federal government. I would give more autonomy to teachers. In exchange, I would also give them more money. In exchange, I would give them less job protection. In New York, we've got this hundreds of page teacher contract that basically dictates every little thing that you can ask a teacher to do and really limits the amount of feedback and accountability they get. I would make the contract with teachers very slim and basically treat them more like we treat any other profession of professionals, right? I would also, in some cases, push for later retirement so that teachers, if you're going to retire with full benefits, we're really talking about a normal mid-60s retirement age, not in some cases, being able to retire in your 50s and sometimes earlier with full benefits, right? We really need people to stay in the profession as long as possible, especially when we're using public resources. But again, this would be a decision I would push as much as possible down to the school level. In some cases, you can't do that. You have to do it at a system level, but I would really push these decisions down as local as possible. And for teachers, I'll get to this more in the school model discussion, but I would de-emphasize content in certain cases, meaning we often think about, are you the 5th grade math teacher, the 7th grade math teacher, writing teacher, and we're often talking about, like, how do we get more and more content knowledge, right? I think content knowledge is important, but it's becoming less important given the quality of the resources that exist now outside of the school building. Resources like Khan Academy and the sort of just infinite amount of amazing math, science, and now in some cases literacy tools that we have out there. You still need teachers to geek out on content, but what I would really be looking for are more coach than content leaders. Think about your best teachers, right? In some cases, the later you got into high school, yeah, maybe some of them were great content leaders, but if you think about, your best 6th, 7th grade teachers, were they great at content? Maybe, but they were coaches. They were people who really got a chance to get to know you. They inspired you. They motivated you. They held you accountable. And that's the skill set I would really be teaching our teachers. And if we loosen things up and changed the traditional model that we have, we could really unleash our adults on our students in a more meaningful way. I would want the teacher to move with the students. So wherever possible, your 1st grade teacher, your 2nd grade teacher, your 3rd, 4th, 5th is the same person, because the skill set there is not, to me, age dependent. Although when you get to the really early ages, that you probably want a specialist with kids who, need help going to the bathroom or whatever, or with fine, building their motor skills. But the older they get, you really want, teachers to get to know the students, help them set goals, help hold them accountable and to inspire them to hit those goals, help them develop values and habits that are meaningful. And so I'd want them to move with the students. And a good example here as to how we could do this is New York, where the workforce in New York City schools is around 135,000 full-time staff members for a group of students around 912,000 students. So that's one staff member for every 6.8 students. You might want to ask yourself why we have schools then where the common experience is a bunch of kids in a classroom, 20, 30 kids, depending on where you are, and one adult on the stage speaking to those students. Why is that what we've done with that one staff member to 6.8 student model? You'd expect that we would probably find more ways to break up those groups and actually have more one-on-one, one-on-two, one-on-three time with staff members and students. And that's why we need to think differently about the delivery mechanism and our grade levels, which is something I'll come back to when I talk about school models. We want to make teachers less rule followers and more entrepreneurs, right? Right now, in a school system, teachers are often trained implicitly to try to avoid controversy and stay out of trouble. But what I want to do is loosen up our budgets, create more flexibility, remove constraints so that teachers can have money, resources. Like you should almost, if I had a teacher, I'd almost have them managing a mini P&L within a school saying, all right, here are the 8 to 10, maybe 15, depending on what resources in your school system you have, students that are under my responsibility. I have a budget, almost like a small business, and I'm going to, based on the needs of my students, I'm going to spend that money. So if I'm an 8th grade teacher and Sally is becoming really passionate about, chemistry, right? I am going to prioritize spending some of my budget on getting Sally to go visit the Cornell chemistry department, or the Liberty Science Center, or the Museum of Natural History, or I want to bring in a content expert who can help coach her up on the very high level chemistry she's doing right now, or spend money on a Coursera course because she's now in 11th grade and she's well beyond AP chemistry, and I want to credential her at Coursera in MIT general chemistry, right? I would want teachers to have that kind of flexibility, right? Right now, principals don't even have that kind of flexibility in the traditional system. I'd also have more focus on craft. And this is more sometimes down at the school level, but there are people like our friend Doug Lamov, who has a podcast called Sweat the Technique with us. Doug and others like Norman Atkins and Julie Jackson at the Uncommon Schools Network created with others a graduate school of education called the Relay Graduate School, which had a particular model for what it meant to be a great teacher and a heavily action practice oriented approach to teaching people that method of teaching. And then there are others who have different methods of teaching. Success Academies in New York, for example, a lot of these come from charters in part because of the level of innovation that charters were bringing at that time. And I would do a lot more within the sector to develop models like that, which is articulating a theory of the case about what makes great teaching, and sometimes there'll be conflicting ideas about what makes great teaching, and then systematizing the teaching of the teaching, so that instead of what we have now at graduate schools, which are largely useless, esoteric, pie in the sky types of academic institutions, which have in a lot of cases almost no correlation to excellence within the classroom, I would be seeding and creating more of these pipelines from system to practice in teaching, and as a way to professionalize teaching. I would also have full, robust loan forgiveness for great institutions of learning. So right now we have the teacher loan forgiveness program and the public service loan forgiveness program at the federal level, which do some loan forgiveness for teachers, but I would make these far more expansive. And I would say that basically if you devote yourself, let's say 10 years to teaching in public schools or nonprofit public charter schools, then, or we can even expand to private schools that have a certain amount of kids of a level of economic diversity, then you get your loans completely forgiven in this country. And, no questions asked, right? That would be a much more robust version than what we have right now. I would go even further than that and say, if you're willing to move to areas where we have major teaching shortages, like we did a story on Mississippi where they have like virtual teachers on screens in some places because they can't find teachers. So if you're willing to move to Sunflower, Mississippi or wherever, we'll give you a 0 interest loan to buy a house in that area. So number one, if you're buying a house, you're more likely to stay there. But we could say, the 0 interest home loan only lasts as long as you're teaching there. And so if it's a 30-year mortgage, you pay it off in 30 years. We got you there 30 years teaching. That's great. But I would incentivize more in a robust way to get people to go out there into these forgotten places, right? Like my movement, the charter school reform community, we're really focused on urban education reform. But the more time you spend out there in these rural communities, which I was blessed to do when I was out in Mississippi and helping some of these communities that couldn't start charters think through their educational plans, they have a whole different set of challenges. And it really starts with getting energetic, in some cases young at heart, people who are truly idealistic to get out there into those communities. Now let's talk about school design. I generally think that the whole goal in loosening things up is to allow for varied designs of schools. But what I want to do just by way of demonstration is talk about a school I would design, which is a high school. And I'm building on something, I wrote an essay a couple of years ago called, I think it was like My Dream High School or something like that. And I'm just going to build on that and basically update what I was saying there. And then I'll come back around to what the whole purpose of talking about what my dream school is beyond trying to inspire people to start schools like this. At a structural level at school, I'd have no grade levels. I want kids to do what we call competency-based learning. So basically move through subject areas as they master those subject areas, right? And Populous, the study that I referenced earlier, shows that in 2019, when parents were asked to rank all the different goals they had within a school system, this idea of this was what their quote, which is students advance once they achieved mastery, like asking parents, like, how much do you value that consideration within schools? That ranked 30th in 2019. So it was near the bottom of considerations for parents. 2022, that same statement, students advance once they achieve mastery, was ranked 7th. What happened from 2019 to 2022? Well, the pandemic happened. I think parents saw their kids advancing through material faster. Those kids were on platforms like Khan Academy. And I think parents realized, oh, wow, there is a real power in competency-based learning. And what this allows for, if you do it at a school level, is schools can be better at the various levels of the continuum, right? When I was a school leader, there were some kids who entered 5th grade who couldn't read. And then there were some students who were entering 5th grade reading at a high school level, some late high school level. And in our traditional system, all those kids are in the same 5th grade class. Maybe you're tracking. So like if you have 4 5th grade classes, you're going to group them by reading ability, et cetera. But this is an imperfect way to do things. It's very controversial to track that way. But it's also imprecise because sometimes the kid who's struggling with reading might be advanced in math, but now they might be grouped by reading ability and they're bored in math class because some of the other kids in their math class are way further behind. And the teacher is also being torn in a number of different directions, which is like the more advanced kids are bored. If you're really slowing down the lesson to teach to the kids who are still struggling, or if you're trying to meet the kids who are at the advanced level and challenge them, you might skirt over misunderstandings and knowledge gaps for the kids at the lower level. So what you really need to do is allow kids to move through the material at the level that they can. And there are structural ways you could do this within a school. And it gets to the teacher as coach model, right? Instead of one teacher in front of 25 kids at a time in traditional subjects, you have more flexible spaces so that you have certain adults who are watching larger groups of kids as they each go through, and computers allow for this, but you could do this without computers. Allow kids to go through their material based on whatever their needs are, while some of the teachers are pulling students for one-on-one, one-on-three, one-on-four, either coaching conversations or tutoring conversations. In some cases, just accountability conversations. I've talked about that a lot on this pod before, so I won't go into greater detail of that. And that really underscores why we need teachers as coach. It allows for that model, but it also, what I just described, destigmatizes special education and helps us integrate special education into the traditional program. Because if every student has the equivalent of what I just described, is kind of like every student getting an individualized educational plan, like an IEP, then the kid who has an IEP because it's prescribed by law and because they have a particularly prescribed need from specialists is not going to feel much different to the rest of the kids in the system, and they're not going to miss all these collective experiences that may happen when you're pulling kids out of classrooms because they're just part of a system that everybody else is in. They might just have more robust supports within that system. I would also have frequent low-stakes assessments over infrequent high-stakes assessments. Like right now, we have these big high-stakes tests at the end of the year, and that data really doesn't go anywhere other than for maybe accountability purposes, if in the rare circumstances in which we hold people accountable for these tests. I actually think Florida is kind of heading in the right direction here by breaking these into quarterly and less frequent assessments. Any good school you see out there uses these less frequent assessments. In the charter world, there's a whole separate set of assessments that people take either monthly or quarterly. I used to take these tests called the Achievement Network tests that we paid extra for, that were leveled to the state standardized tests. But as you know, anytime you're learning anything, you don't just say, oh, I'm going to gauge whether I know this thing at the end of the year. You really need weekly, daily, sometimes checks for understanding. And I would be emphasizing that more over these big standardized tests, which I, again, believe are important markers for whether students know what they need to know. Within the school, I would make attention management its own domain. And every grade level, every day, basically, I would have some exploration of what it means to master your attention. And I would take students through that exploration and discussion, really through a science of concentration, why we have trouble focusing, what certain technologies do to tap into our propensity for distraction, and what we could do about it. So, for example, TikTok, which is obviously very popular with young people, I would pull it apart metaphorically and say what makes it addictive. And I would compare the user experience at TikTok and the algorithms there to other popular social media platforms like Instagram. And I would really embrace the students' desire to know about these technologies, to teach them what those technologies are doing to them. These students, a lot of them want to be influencers. And basically, I would try to push them not only to understand these tools of influence, but also to talk about what does it mean to consume versus create. To say, like, look, stipulated that you're going to want to be an influencer, but let's actually talk about what it means to create good content. And I would also help develop their passion and identity alongside, in the case of influencing, what does it mean to be an influencer, right? So to say, like, all right, you don't want to just be an influencer full stop. You want to be a great surgeon who happens to have a super active TikTok account, if that's what you want. I don't want you just to be an influencer. I want you to be an athlete and an influencer, or a musician and an influencer, and show people that actually the people who truly break through and have meaning on those platforms are people who are independently impressive and just happen to use those tools to express to the world and build a community around what makes them impressive. Students would receive 2 grades in this sort of attention management class. One would be a more traditional letter or number grade based on their mastery of the history and science in the class, like, for instance, like the anatomy and chemistry of dopamine pathways. The second grade would be a self-assessment and wouldn't show up on their report card, but in practice, it would mean that every week students would reflect on their own screen time usage, compare it, their time spent on different apps, and how they plan to spend and achieve their personal goals. By the end of their 4 years in high school, students would become adept, hopefully, at blocking out their days to create uninterrupted deep work. So they would have more and more control over their schedules throughout the course of high school, so that by the end, they're largely independent, and they would learn to batch smaller tasks that require less cognitive capacity and learning, and they would be more deliberate about the bigger chunks of time that they need to have. And their evolution would mirror the changes of the school day. So meaning as they get older, they progress through the process, they get more control. This could seem a little bit paradoxical based on what I just said, but I would block out at least half the day without technology at all. To the extent people are using phones ever, it would be in a very targeted way. So for instance, if we're teaching kids about influencing and the technologies of TikTok, et cetera, yeah, there are times when they're going to have to use their phones to do some of that stuff, but it would be a very purposeful use of the technology. Otherwise, phones are away throughout the entire day. And when they're using laptops, that's part of the day. But for a huge chunk of the day, whether it's through physical activity, which I'll get to, whether it's through collaboration, whether it's through reading on paper, writing on paper, I would really push kids to spend half the day without technology. And that would be our marker of a successful day, is if a kid is spending at least half the day nowhere near their technology. I would also teach kids how to learn. And I would make this a constant question, right? We often think about, well, do our teachers know the right techniques to teach kids, right? But how often do kids actually learn those techniques and how to apply them in their own lives? Like, how do you know, for instance, do you know about spaced repetition, for example, and how that's a more effective way than rewriting your notes or using note cards in kind of in a haphazard way, or the Feynman technique, right? The idea that, if students are explaining concepts to each other in certain ways, they're actually getting better at the content themselves. The idea of note-taking versus question-taking and other active learning practices, which I think a lot of elite college students know how to do. Let's teach kids that in high school and middle school. And we want to just generally tighten the learning loops, right? So instead of just kids sitting there taking notes while a sage on the stage talks and maybe doing some practice problems, the athletic urgency of the classroom goes up a notch, if not many notches, right? Just go to your school down the street, watch your football practice or your basketball or volleyball practices, right? And just look at the urgency, the tight loops of learning different elements of the sport. and just how people are using their time. Chances are it's really urgent and they're pushing boundaries constantly. Then go into your chemistry class, right? You got somebody talking, probably droning on, and students listening, taking notes, right? Up the urgency of learning, get students to be way more active and get them to learn actually why it is that that more active learning approach is actually more effective, so that when they leave your school, they're not just, they're mastering the skills and knowledge and content that you're trying to master every day in each of those classes, but they're also now going to go on to college and life and be really great learners, right? Because they know why these techniques work and they have portable techniques and skills to use in other places in life. On the question of writing, like we spend a lot of time in high school and especially elite schools, and the Common Core talks about this, of writing like expository essays and narrative essays. And we have these categories of writing that I think have been largely left intact since I was a kid, right? And there's a little bit of innovation on the edges here. But by and large, like kids are writing different forms of expository essays and narrative essays every year for most of their existence, right? And they get bored with these things. And they also ask themselves, like, how often do you write an expository essay, right? Like if you're a journalist, maybe you're writing some equivalent of that, a decent amount, but you're probably doing things like writing memos and business plans, emails, maybe even social media captions. If you're in the creative arts, you're much more likely to write a script, whether it's for a commercial, a TV show, a movie, in some cases, social media videos, than you are to write a story of some kind, a 2 to 3 page story, right? Or even a narrative essay. And so, yes, students should have novels in schools. They should know how to write creative fiction. They should know how to write expository essays, but we should be moving past those things really fast to areas that are much more relevant to students. They should be writing scripts, business plans, memos, yes, even social media captions. We should also be thinking differently about the mediums of communication, right? People think of like, there's English lit, way of thinking about novels, right? It was like, all right, we got to like have everybody read The Catcher in the Rye, right? Well, novels for most of our existence were a form of entertainment, right? And other books and newspapers were a form of imparting information. And now we have other ways to impart information, right? And to entertain people, largely through screens. Now, I know I just said that I want our kids to spend a lot of time off of their screens. And there is some tension here. But I do want to take seriously the idea that our students are communicating, and they're going to be in a world where people are largely communicating through means that are different than what they're experiencing in schools, right? The equivalent of The Catcher in the Rye is going to be way less influential than the equivalent of, a really path-breaking movie or TV show, right? Those just have more influence today than the novel of today. And the novels of yesteryear were the equivalent of the collective experience that we now have through our screens and other ways, and we need to take that into account. Now, there are innovative ways you can do this without screens too, right? So you can have kids handwrite and brainstorm memos, scripts, for instance. You can have kids on, internet-locked laptops where they're using Final Draft, for instance, and, note cards and storyboards to build out stories so that they really learn what does it mean to create a great story before they actually sit down and write it, right? There are all kinds of ways that you can either eliminate the internet or screens so you can achieve that 50%, while also having kids work on things that eventually find their way to the screens. Because whether we like it or not, that's how the world is run right now. I would be heavy on content, so science and history, and I would make those applied areas of content. So in history, instead of just like, hey, here are these historical periods, write it down. I'm going to ask you multiple choice questions and maybe a few essays. I would have lots of debates, lots of student-run lectures, student-created documentaries, student-written textbooks. The emphasis will be on the doing, right? The act of creation, wherever possible. Science, the applied area of this could look, for instance, like, what we didn't do when I was in high school, which is our high school's message on substance abuse was essentially don't do drugs. And a lot of my friends did a lot of drugs and some of them died from it, right? This is a pretty high stakes series of mistakes that our schools are doing. A lot of us rolled our eyes at the finger wagging, and it just had no effect on us. I would integrate these things into our science courses. So I would, for instance, have a course on the chemistry and biology of drugs, alcohol, social media, gambling, right? Talk about the biology and chemistry of addiction and what those mechanisms are and what we could do about it, right? And I would do this in tons of different areas of life so that people are not just learning things in these sort of stodgy biology, chemistry, earth science, but actually tell students a story about the world that they're living in that makes it relevant and have them apply that science to their lives. On the question of knowledge and critical thinking, there's a passage from Steven Pinker that I think really distills down. I think he meant this in the context of higher education, but he wrote in an Atlantic article many years ago the following. And basically, he was asking the question about what educated people should know. He says, "It seems to me that educated people should know something about the 13 billion year prehistory of our species and the basic laws governing the physical and living world, including our bodies and brains. They should grasp the timeline of human history from the dawn of agriculture to the present. They should be exposed to the diversity of human cultures and the major systems of belief and value with which they have made sense of their lives. They should know about the formative events in human history, including the blunders we hope not to repeat. They should understand the principles behind democratic governance and the rule of law. They should know how to appreciate works of fiction and art as sources of aesthetic pleasure and as impetuses to reflect on the human condition. On top of this knowledge, a liberal education should make certain habits of rationality second nature. Educated people should be able to express complex ideas in clear writing and speech. They should appreciate that objective knowledge is precious commodity and know how to distinguish fetid fact from superstition, rumor, and unexamined conventional wisdom. They should know how to reason logically and statistically, avoiding the fallacies and biases to which the untutored human mind is vulnerable. They should think causally rather than magically and know what it takes to distinguish causation from correlation and coincidence. They should be acutely aware of human fallibility, most notably their own, and appreciate that people who disagree with them are not stupid or evil. Accordingly, they should appreciate the value of trying to change minds by persuasion rather than intimidation or demagoguery." That was Pinker. I think that's an excellent start. I'd add a few elements to that. So, for instance, I would expose students to old political and philosophical debates, things like socialism versus capitalism, consequentialism versus deontology. But I'd also introduce them to relatively new ones or ones that have taken on a different flavor recently. Techno-optimism versus pessimism, interdependence versus protectionism, privacy versus security. I'd also lean into the political circus around things like the critical race theory debates by having students themselves read commentary and excerpts about things like the 1619 Project on the left and 1776 Project on the right, have them debate the merits of those curricula using primary source material to verify or refute claims, as well as deal with the culture clashes that have resulted from those projects and debates. On the math front, I would take a page from the Gates Foundation, which wants to emphasize statistics and data science more. But I would want to do it in a rigorous way. California, I think, did this in a sloppy, unrigorous way. And I would also have more probability within schools because we actually deal with probability a lot. And you think about it, it's not that I wouldn't have calculus, but I think everything is kind of leading towards for the advanced kids, especially towards mastery of calculus. And you think about, for those of you who took calculus, how often do you use calculus in life? And if you were to say that you had a deep grounding in probability and statistics and data science, well, how often would you be able to apply that knowledge? Probably a lot more. On the question of sports, athletics, and physical stuff, I would separate out the physical fitness and physical challenge from team sports because I think they're related, but they achieve different things. On the physical challenge side of things, I would really upgrade the sort of presidential challenge stuff that we all went through, which was kind of a once a year experience. And I would really make it an integrated approach where the way that we measure academic learning, I would want to measure physical progress, right? I know that people are very sensitive about this kind of stuff and kids are all different and yada, yada, but I would hold a high bar and say, look, we want you to be as strong, fast, healthy as possible. And we want to expose you to a range of different types of activities, whether it's like in our world as adults, we think of things like zone 2 versus zone 5 cardio, endurance versus explosive strength, flexibility, right? We want to really teach kids and help move them through a progression of being as strong and fast and cardio healthy as possible. We also want to teach them things like good sleep hygiene and nutrition, and mental well-being, and obviously, mixing that, some of the more dicey subjects that require parent buy-in, like, sexual education, et cetera. So I would put that all within one bucket, but I would really create measurable progress for kids so that they can actually move along a continuum. On the team sports side of things, like, yes, like a good school should have like good elite sports, but I would really spend a lot more time on generalizable sports so that students are playing a range of different activities throughout their time in schools, not just like haphazardly during traditional gym class. And I would have the emphasis be on learning team dynamics, leadership, and solving your own problems without adults, right? I think that's a really important thing we learn in team sports. And I actually think the range part of this is really important. There's a book by Richard Epstein called Range, which actually talks about like when you actually talk about elite athletes, actually exposing them to a lot of different sports is important. And I'll quote from him. He says, the breadth of training predicts breadth of transfer. That is, the more context in which something is learned, the more the learner creates abstract models and the less they rely on any particular example. Learners become better at applying their knowledge to a situation they've never seen before, which is the essence of creativity. So in a nutshell, what Epstein is arguing is that we should expose kids to a range of experience, and this is not just athletics, but it does apply to athletics. And then they'll become more creative and agile in what they eventually decide to do long term as a passion. And that could be they decide to do many different things. Now, I would also give students, and this would be much easier to do in a system of schools in bigger cities, I would require kids to learn at least one tactile, practical skill in leaving school. So fire, EMT, nursing, plumbing, mechanics, hacking, advanced audio, video production, carpentry. I would make them learn at least one of those and perhaps give them the opportunity to learn a few of those skills. Obviously, if you're in a city, this could be easier. You could have little specialized centers that kids go to either at the end of the school day or for certain like sabbatical style learning experiences. It could even be what we do send kids to do during summers, which is time that we just assume is lost, right? And I would have kids at least learn employable level expertise in one of those areas, if not more. And I would also have within my school a lot of rituals, routines, right? Color wars, mottos, school songs, etc. Like healthy schools have this. In my school, I used to do a haunted house, for example, that was so epic that we ran out of storage space for our mechanical clowns and smoke machines. We had a color war during February. This time of year is really difficult for schools. We'd have a color war. We had certain, we had certain routines around when we were going to have our theater and our assemblies and the chants that we had and the mottos that we had. I'd also teach group responsibility. I'd instill in students a passion for leaving the school better than they found it, along with a sense of obligation to the institution. Each class would set goals each year on how they would improve the school, and they can have an annual report at the end of the year evaluating themselves against those goals. And of course, that's another area of ritual. I love what Marian Wright Edelman has said about this, which is really education is about leaving the world better than you found it. And really, when I think about the sum total of whether we've done a good job of educating our kids, which is really what we work backwards from in creating schools, I would ask myself 3 questions. Did the kid create a distinct identity, right? That is the most important part of being in schools. Like, you think about your time in school, really. It's like, have you created an identity for yourself? How do you see yourself? Is that a positive identity? Can you connect your identity to a larger purpose? So can you actually say, here's my place in the world? And have you made progress and set yourself up to pursue that identity, right? Are you ready to leave this institution and become the person you want to be? So do you have a distinct identity? Can you connect your identity to a larger purpose? And have you made progress to set yourself up to pursue that identity? I like what Helen Keller said on this, which is the purpose of education is to make a place for yourself in the world. That's basically what she's talking about. Matthew McConaughey, the great American, said that life is not a popularity contest. Be brave, take the hill, but first answer the question, what is my hill? That's what I want our students to know. So to the question I started with around whether to lean into the individualism, the isolation, whether our schools should become a reflection or a cure for that isolation and individualism, I say they could be a cure, but that doesn't mean that our solution needs to be top down. The purpose in going through my dream of high school was not to say this is the one model to do it. Although if you're listening to this and you want to create that, please let me know. It goes to demonstrate that all of the things by and large that I talked about are not possible in a system where there's a lot of top-down constraints, where the trajectory of our education system is dictated either through Washington or even your state capital, and maybe not even your city chancellor of schools office, right? These types of bold moves are only possible when we put more decision-making power in the hands of people on the ground. And so I think we can embrace that localism. We can embrace local control. We could put more control in the hands of people to create vibrant communities, because that's what schools really are. They're communities. And I think the cure to this individualization, individualism, isolation, drift, lack of purpose, lack of civic engagement, lack of connection that we have all over this country is to create better communities, better schools. So with that, that is all I have to say. I probably missed a lot here. There's probably a lot of stuff I didn't talk about. But I want to thank all of you who are involved in our education system. You're really heroes out there. And I know I'm hard on certain elements of the system, but the people who wake up every single day to help our kids, you're the real heroes in this country. And I know people don't make it easy for you. And, whether you agree or disagree with me on some of the policy areas here or even practice, what I'm trying to do is make the experience for those of you who are doing the work, and most importantly, the people who receive our work, the students, as excellent, purposeful, positive, and effective as possible. And so if you have your own ideas, please send them in. I love hearing people's ambitious ideas for K-12 schools. Our voicemail is 321-200-0570. Our email is lostdebate@thebranchmedia.org. Be safe out there.